March 7, 1945, the west bank of the Rhine River. The air trembles with artillery. Smoke crawls across the water like a living thing. Charred trees stand twisted against a sky stained orange by fire. Across the river, German soldiers peer through their field glasses, eyes wide, disbelieving. On the opposite shore, American engineers work in silence and precision. Helmets glint, hands blur. They drag heavy pontoon sections through mud and shattered stone, snapping them together with the rhythm of practiced hands. Machine gun fire rattles over the water, but the work never stops. A corporal shouts an order. Another soldier tightens a cable, then dives flat as a shell explodes meters away. Within hours, a bridge, something that should take days, begins to stretch across the Rhine. What the Germans witnessed that day wasn't just bravery. It was engineering warfare reborn. By the winter of 1944, the Western Front had become a vast battlefield of exhaustion and resolve. The Allies, having broken through Normandy and swept across France, now faced the most formidable natural barrier in Western Europe, the Rhine River. It wasn't just a body of water, it was the symbolic spine of Germany, a boundary that had protected the Reich for centuries. Beyond it lay the heart of Hitler's empire, Cologne, the Ruhr, and the road to Berlin. Every mile closer to the Rhine had been fought for through towns reduced to rubble and forests turned into graves. The German army, though battered and retreating, fought with desperate ferocity. Hitler had ordered that no bridge over the Rhine fall into enemy hands intact. Every crossing point was mined, every approach defended with artillery, snipers, and machine gun nests dug deep into the river banks. For the American forces, speed was everything. Eisenhower's grand strategy depended on momentum, on never allowing the Wehrmacht time to regroup. But rivers were time. They forced pauses, demanded patience, and patience cost lives. Each major river, the Meuse, the Moselle, the Saar, had already tested the Allied advance. By the time the front reached the Rhine, everyone understood. The key to entering Germany was not tanks or infantry, but engineers. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had grown from a technical branch into one of the most indispensable forces of the war. Trained in bridging, demolition, fortification, and logistics, they were builders under fire. They could turn chaos into passageways, mud into mobility. While infantry cleared villages and artillery silenced hills, the engineers followed behind, laying Bailey bridges across craters, stringing pontoon rafts over rivers, and repairing shattered roads before the next column arrived. By early 1945, these men had become masters of improvisation. They could construct a 200-foot floating bridge in hours, even under shell fire. Their trucks carried prefabricated panels, pontoons, and folding boats. Each bridge was not just an engineering project, it was a race against the enemy, against collapsing morale, and against the clock. But on the eastern bank of the Rhine, the Germans were watching. They knew the Allied engineers were coming, and they had turned the river into a trap. Heavy artillery batteries were hidden in forests. Observation posts lined the cliffs. Every likely crossing site was registered for immediate bombardment. The Rhine was supposed to be impregnable, a final defensive wall before the heart of the Reich. Still, the Americans prepared. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group and Montgomery's 21st were closing in from the west and north. Supply convoys thundered day and night. Thousands of tons of bridging material piled up in depots across France and Belgium. It was clear to every commander, crossing the Rhine would be one of the last great battles of the war, and its success would depend not on who fired the most shells, but on who could build the fastest under fire. As February 1945 turned to March, reconnaissance photos revealed a strange sight. Bridges being blown up by German hands, towns burning on their own side of the river. The Germans were preparing to make their stand. And yet, In the midst of destruction, the Allies saw opportunity. If even one bridge survived, even for a few hours, it could change the war's course entirely. And then came word from Remagen, a small town with a bridge still standing. Remagen was not supposed to matter. On most war maps, it was a small dot, a modest town on the west bank of the Rhine, with a single steel structure linking it to Erpel on the eastern side. The Ludendorff Bridge. Built during the First World War for military logistics, it was an imposing construction of steel trusses and concrete towers, nearly 200 feet long. Its dark silhouette stretched across the river like a relic of an older war, now standing in the path of a new one. By early March 1945, German forces had already begun demolishing their Rhine bridges to halt the Allied advance. Hitler had declared that any officer who failed to destroy a bridge before the enemy reached it would be court-martialed or executed. For the Reich, the Rhine was a final line of survival. For the Allies, it was the last obstacle before total victory. To the American engineers studying reconnaissance photos, the challenge was immense. The Rhine varied between 400 and 1,000 yards wide, with unpredictable currents and steep embankments. The surrounding terrain was littered with mines and craters, making approach roads nearly impassable for heavy equipment. Any bridging attempt would require extraordinary coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, all while the engineers built exposed to enemy fire. The Germans were confident that this natural barrier would buy them time. They called it the Teutonic Shield. Commanders believed that if they could hold the Allies west of the Rhine for even a few weeks, it might allow them to negotiate a defensive stand deeper inside Germany. They were wrong, not because of overwhelming numbers or air power, but because of something far quieter: organization and speed. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had refined both to perfection. Their Bailey Bridge systems, modular steel panels designed in Britain but mass-produced in American factories, could be assembled by hand, without cranes or heavy machinery. Each component was interchangeable, allowing for rapid construction in nearly any condition. To supplement these, the Americans also relied on floating pontoon bridges, treadway bridges mounted on trucks, and amphibious craft capable of carrying tanks. Every engineer knew his task to the second. Some assembled sections, others drove vehicles into position, others laid cables across the riverbed for anchoring. They worked by stopwatch and by instinct. During training, officers had drilled them with one commandment: speed is survival. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from the German side painted a different picture. Supply lines were collapsing. Fuel was scarce. Bridges were blown prematurely. Local commanders struggled to communicate with Berlin as Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Yet even in disarray, German artillery along the Rhine remained deadly accurate, and crossing attempts promised heavy casualties. In this tense environment, Allied leadership began planning simultaneous operations for the inevitable crossing. To the north, Field Marshal Montgomery prepared Operation Plunder, a massive, well-orchestrated assault supported by airborne drops and amphibious tanks. To the south, General Patton's Third Army sharpened its reputation for speed, vowing to beat Monty across the Rhine. But fate would intervene first at Remagen. When American patrols approached the town on March 7th, they were stunned to see the Ludendorff Bridge still intact. Smoke rose from demolition charges that had failed to detonate properly. Through binoculars, engineers and infantrymen stared in disbelief. The impossible had happened. The last bridge across the Rhine still stood. No one hesitated. Within minutes, orders were shouted. Tanks began to roll forward. Engineers grabbed their gear. And before the Germans on the far bank could react, the race for the Rhine, and for history, had begun. 1. The human angle. Builders in the line of fire. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't charge machine gun nests or storm bunkers. Yet no one faced a colder kind of courage than the engineers who built under fire. Most were in their early 20s, carpenters, mechanics, or students before the war, now carrying steel sections instead of rifles. At Remagen, they crawled across the trembling Ludendorff Bridge as artillery shells tore the air. Each explosion sent waves through the structure. The deck groaned under the weight of tanks and trucks already pushing forward. Yet they worked relentlessly, tightening bolts, reinforcing beams, cutting away smoldering debris. Some were killed mid-task, their bodies falling silently into the Rhine. Others stepped over them, continuing the work as though nothing had changed. For the soldiers crossing, these men were ghosts, moving shapes through smoke and chaos. Their calm under pressure became the lifeline of the entire army. One officer later wrote, "It wasn't the bridge that held. It was the men. Their motivation wasn't glory. It was purpose, to make sure others could keep moving." Engineers understood that if the bridge failed, thousands would die stranded on the wrong side. Each bolt tightened was a heartbeat in the rhythm of survival. The technological angle, engineering the impossible. What set the U.S. Army apart in 1945 wasn't only manpower, it was method. Engineering had become a form of warfare. The Bailey Bridge, a symbol of Allied ingenuity, changed the very tempo of combat. Composed of small, prefabricated panels, it could be carried by a few men and assembled without cranes. Each 10-foot section locked into the next like pieces of a puzzle. Within hours, these steel skeletons could span rivers that once took days to cross. For wider rivers like the Rhine, engineers relied on treadway pontoon bridges. Each floating unit, a 25-foot aluminum pontoon, was linked together with heavy steel beams. On top, metal planking allowed Sherman tanks to drive across with astonishing stability. Anchored by cables and guided by assault boats, these bridges could flex with the current while bearing tons of weight. At night, the scene looked surreal. Flares illuminating a river alive with motion. Trucks unloaded pontoons. Cranes swung beams into place. Spotlights reflected off wet steel. The roar of generators mixed with the splash of oars and the crack of artillery. In hours, an entire floating highway appeared where only water had been. German observers couldn't believe the speed. Reports described American bridging operations as machine-like. One officer wrote in his diary that they build faster than we can destroy. Behind that speed was meticulous planning. Each engineer unit carried color-coded kits, cables, clamps, bolts, and welding tools organized for assembly in total darkness. The Rhine, long seen as impenetrable, was being conquered not by tanks, but by templates and timing. It was the ultimate expression of modern war, the blend of muscle, metal, and mathematics. Every bridge was a calculated act of defiance against the chaos of battle. An assertion that ingenuity could triumph over destruction. The bridges rose, the soldiers crossed, and the engineers stayed, ensuring nothing collapsed before the next convoy arrived. But behind the brilliance of design and the rhythm of teamwork lay something deeper. A tactical ballet, where every movement on the riverbank was life or death. And on those riverbanks, timing became the true weapon. 3. The tactical angle. Speed as a weapon on the Rhine's western shore, tactics replaced brute strength. The engineers worked not just to build, but to outthink. Every movement was synchronized to seconds. Before a single pontoon touched the water, artillery batteries unleashed covering fire on the far bank. Smoke generators cloaked the river in gray, thick enough to hide the silhouettes of men and machinery. The operation unfolded like choreography. Engineers maneuvered assault boats first, ferrying the initial infantry across. Then came rafts carrying jeeps and anti-tank guns. Only when a foothold was secured did the full bridge construction begin. They worked by stopwatch. 20 minutes to anchor pontoons, 15 to link panels, another 10 to reinforce with beams. Every minute saved meant fewer dead. Tanks waited engines running. ready to cross before the bridge was even fully completed. Commanders didn't need elegance, they needed results. Build fast or die trying, one combat engineer recalled. And yet, amid this cold efficiency, there was artistry. The engineers adapted to every terrain: shallow waters, strong currents, bombed roads. When sections sank or cables snapped, they didn't stop. They rebuilt. The enemy shelled the river mercilessly, but speed itself became protection. Before German gunners could recalibrate, the bridge was already done. In the words of one German prisoner, "We thought it was impossible." They crossed as if the river wasn't even there. The enemy angle, disbelief and collapse. From the opposite bank, German soldiers watched in disbelief. Through periscopes and rangefinders, they saw silhouettes emerging from smoke. Not infantry in waves, but teams of builders. To them, it looked insane. Men hammering, bolting, and dragging floating decks under direct fire. Orders came to destroy the bridges at all costs. Artillery units fired continuously. Luftwaffe aircraft, though few remained, attempted desperate bombing runs. Yet nothing stopped the crossings. Every bridge destroyed seemed to reappear overnight. For every pontoon hit, 2 more floated downriver. German command reports from March 1945 reveal a tone of shock. Enemy bridging operations proceed with unprecedented speed. Counterfire ineffective. The once proud Rhine defense line was unraveling not from defeat in battle, but from disbelief. Disbelief that the Americans could construct highways over water faster than the Reich could destroy them. Morale crumbled. Some units retreated without orders. Others surrendered, convinced the Allies had some new secret technology. But there was no secret. Only discipline, planning, and courage in the open. The Germans had underestimated the engineers, men who didn't carry medals or speeches, only blueprints and bolts. Their efficiency under fire shattered the myth of the Rhine as an unbreachable wall. The leadership angle. Vision. Beyond the front line, behind every crossing stood generals who understood that speed meant victory. Eisenhower viewed engineering as the spine of mobility. No army can move without roads, bridges, and fuel, he had said early in the campaign. And by 1945, that philosophy defined Allied strategy. Field Marshal Montgomery, a master of coordination, planned his Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder, with surgical precision. He gathered over 20,000 engineers, thousands of vehicles, and hundreds of bridging boats. Every bridge site was rehearsed on mock terrain in England before the real assault. Patton, by contrast, embodied audacity. When he reached the Rhine earlier than expected, he refused to wait for orders. He famously telegraphed Eisenhower, "I'm across." His engineers had thrown bridges across the river overnight, working so fast that even his staff officers couldn't believe it. These leaders recognized something profound. The war's end would not be decided by who fired last, but by who crossed first. The engineers were their secret weapon. Silent, relentless, unstoppable. By March 1945, the Rhine crossings had become a symphony of precision, led by generals but played by men in wet uniforms and trembling hands. And, among all crossings, one stood apart, the place where courage met chance. Remagen, where the unthinkable had already begun. March 7, 1945. Noon. The 9th Armored Division of the U.S. First Army reached the outskirts of Remagen. Dust hung over the town like fog. Machine guns rattled in the distance. The soldiers advancing through the rubble had no idea that history waited just ahead of them. Steel, intact, and still standing. When the forward patrol under Lieutenant Karl Timmerman emerged from the shattered streets, they froze. Through the smoke, the silhouette of the Ludendorff Bridge rose above the Rhine. Battered, but whole. Their first reaction wasn't joy, it was disbelief. Every other bridge upstream and downstream had been destroyed. This one should have been nothing but twisted wreckage. Yet, there it stood, trembling under its own weight, demolition charges dangling uselessly from its girders. The German engineers guarding it had already tried to blow it. A series of explosions had ripped through the bridge only minutes before, but the detonators misfired, and much of the structure held. Hitler's strict orders had failed, and now one of the last surviving links across the Rhine lay before the Americans. Timmermann radioed back immediately. Bridge intact at Remagen. The message shot up the chain of command like lightning. Brigadier General William Hoge, commanding Combat Command B, couldn't believe it at first. "If it's still there," he said, "take it." Within minutes, tanks and half-tracks began pouring toward the bridge. Smoke and fire blanketed the air. The Germans on the eastern bank scrambled artillery into position, desperate to finish what their demolition team could not. The Ludendorff Bridge became the center of a furious contest. Seconds against shells, courage against collapse. The engineers were the first to move. Under sniper fire, they sprinted across the bridge to cut loose remaining charges. Bullets sparked off steel. The wooden planks shuddered under their boots. Several men fell, killed instantly or thrown into the river below. But the rest pressed forward, ripping wires, tossing fuses into the water. Then came the infantry, crouching low, darting from girder to girder. Halfway across, a massive explosion tore through the deck, one of the few charges that had finally ignited. The blast ripped a hole through the structure and sent debris crashing into the Rhine. But the bridge held. Shaken, the engineers and soldiers continued. By late afternoon, the first American troops reached the eastern bank. For the first time in the war, Allied soldiers stood on the far side of the Rhine. Germany's sacred frontier. Word spread like wildfire. Across the front, radios crackled with the same phrase. "We're across the Rhine, at Remagen." The German response was immediate and furious. Field Marshal Walter Model ordered every available artillery piece to target the bridge. Luftwaffe pilots, low on fuel, were thrown into suicidal bombing runs. WWII fuhren Tiraun 2 rockets, designed for London, were redirected toward the crossing. The bombardment lasted for days, yet the engineers refused to yield. Reinforcement teams rushed forward, welding, patching, and reinforcing under fire. Tanks began rumbling across, one after another, each weighing over 30 tons. Every vibration sent shivers through the bridge's steel frame. The men below in boats could hear it groaning like a wounded animal. But still it stood. One engineer later wrote in his field diary, "Every time a shell hit, I thought it was the end. But we kept working. We couldn't stop. Not now." The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge stunned the German command and electrified the Allies. Eisenhower called it one of the miracles of the war. For the first time, the Western Allies had a permanent foothold on German soil, ahead of schedule against impossible odds. But Remagen was only the beginning. The bridge would become both a symbol and a battleground, a lifeline that every German gun sought to destroy, and every American hand fought to keep standing. While the fight for the Ludendorff Bridge raged at Remagen, hundreds of miles to the north, another drama was taking shape, one even larger, louder, and meticulously planned. It was Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's grand crossing of the Rhine. On the night of March 23, 1945, the sky over western Germany pulsed with light. Artillery thundered from horizon to horizon. More than 5,000 guns opened fire in unison, turning the eastern bank of the Rhine into a sheet of flame. It was one of the heaviest bombardments of the war, the overture to an engineering and logistical masterpiece. Behind the barrage, tens of thousands of American, British, and Canadian engineers moved into action, Convoys of trucks rumbled toward the river, stacked high with pontoon sections, Bailey bridge panels, and cable drums. The air smelled of fuel and cordite. Every man knew his assignment, down to the minute. At 10 p.m., under a curtain of smoke, the first assault boats pushed into the dark current. Paddles dipped silently. Engines of amphibious tanks, the famous D.D. Shermans, hummed beneath their waterproof screens. Infantry from the 15th Scottish Division and the U.S. 30th Infantry paddled across side by side. The night was alive with tracer fire and the hiss of mortars landing on the opposite bank. Within an hour, the first wave had secured a small strip of land east of the Rhine. Engineers followed immediately, dragging cables, anchoring pontoons, and assembling floating sections by hand. The smoke was so thick they could barely see their own hands, yet they worked by touch and muscle memory. Every clang of metal carried the same rhythm that had echoed through the war. Build, connect, survive. By dawn, the first bridge was taking shape. Pontoon after pontoon locked into place, the structure extending steadily toward the opposite shore. The river's current pulled at it like an animal. But the engineers fought back with ropes and anchors. German artillery found their range, shells plunging into the water, sending geysers over the men. Dozens were killed. Dozens more stepped in to replace them. At 10:30 a.m., British tanks began rolling across, the first to cross the Rhine under fire since Napoleon's time. Onlookers from the western bank cheered as the Shermans roared over the floating roadway, each one spraying mud and smoke into the air. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible. Observation posts reported that new bridges were appearing overnight, as if conjured from the mist. The Wehrmacht tried desperately to respond, firing mortars, dispatching night raiders, even swimming saboteurs across the river. But the pace was unstoppable. Every bridge destroyed was rebuilt by morning. Patton, farther south, was equally relentless. His engineers crossed near Oppenheim, constructing treadway bridges with astonishing speed. In just 48 hours, Patton's forces had built 2 full crossings and moved 4 divisions across. He famously relieved himself in the Rhine, joking later that he wanted to mark his territory. Behind the humor, though, was ruthless drive, a race to collapse Germany from within before the Soviets reached Berlin. By late March, the Rhine, once a symbol of invincibility, had become a highway for Allied armor. Columns of tanks and trucks thundered eastward, leaving behind engineers who still labored on the shaky floating bridges. They repaired, reinforced, and extended, often sleeping on the decks themselves. At Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge still stood, blackened by fire and twisted from stress, yet defiant. For 10 days, it carried thousands of men and vehicles until March 17th, when the structure finally gave in. Without warning, the bridge collapsed into the river, killing 28 engineers working on it. But by then, it no longer mattered. The engineers had already built 2 replacement pontoon bridges beside it. The path into Germany was secure. The turning point of the war had come. Not in a single explosion, but in the steady rhythm of hammers, cables, and courage. The impossible barrier was gone. By the final days of March 1945, the Rhine had ceased to be a frontier. It was a crossing point. What had begun as a desperate gamble at Remagen and a massive planned strike under Operation Plunder turned into a tidal wave of Allied progress. With every bridge completed, the German defenses on the western bank unraveled faster. The crossings opened the gates to Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. American, British, and Canadian columns poured across the river with unrelenting momentum. Tanks rolled east in endless convoys, half-tracks following in their wake, carrying infantry who barely had time to look back at the bridges that made their advance possible. The engineers stayed behind, their uniforms soaked with river water and oil, watching the armored divisions disappear toward Cologne, Dortmund and beyond, German resistance, though fierce in pockets, was collapsing under the strain of constant retreat. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, newly appointed to oversee the defense of Western Germany, admitted privately that the Rhine was lost by speed. The Wehrmacht had counted on time. Time to reposition, to reinforce, to destroy. But the Americans had taken that time away with bolts, cables, and floating decks. Everywhere, the story was the same. Bridges rising out of chaos, pontoon sections scattered with bullet holes, smoke drifting across rivers that no longer mattered. German prisoners, stunned and hollow-eyed, were marched past the very bridges they'd failed to destroy. One captured officer was heard muttering, "We could not understand how they built so fast." At Remagen, the ruins of the Ludendorff Bridge became a monument to endurance. The engineers who died reinforcing it were buried near the riverbank they had conquered. Their replacements built two massive pontoon bridges nearby, carrying supply convoys day and night. Trucks rumbled over planks slick with rain. Military police directed traffic under the glow of dim lanterns. Even in collapse, the rhythm of movement never stopped. From the air, reconnaissance photos showed a transformation that stunned Allied planners. What had once been a defensive barrier now looked like an industrial network. Dozens of bridges crisscrossing the Rhine from north to south, each one a thread pulling the Allies deeper into the Reich. The engineering corps had achieved what entire armies could not. They had erased geography itself. As April began, the effects were immediate. With the Rhine behind them, Allied forces encircled the Ruhr industrial region, trapping nearly 325,000 German troops, the last major pocket of resistance in the West. Supply lines flowed smoothly across the river, uninterrupted. Eisenhower's strategy of broad, steady advance was vindicated. Even the German populace, watching from shattered towns, felt the inevitability. Civilians stood silently on riverbanks, watching American convoys cross the bridges. Some wept, not from fear, but from the realization that the war was ending. To the men who built the bridges, the scale of what they had done only slowly began to sink in. Many had joined the Army Corps of Engineers as construction workers or draftsmen. Now, they had changed the shape of history with their hands. The Rhine crossings weren't just victories. They were proof that discipline and design could triumph over destruction. Yet, amid triumph, there was grief. The engineers paid dearly for every success. Hundreds were killed or wounded by artillery, air raids, or collapsing structures. Their memorials were quiet, carved in wood or stone at the edge of the water. No fanfare, no parades, only the sound of the river that had taken so many of them. But their work endured. The bridges remained long enough to finish the war they helped win. By mid-April 1945, the crossings of the Rhine had done more than just change battle lines. They had shattered the psychological walls of Nazi Germany. For years, propaganda had claimed the Rhine was impenetrable, the sacred border that no enemy would ever breach. Now, that myth lay in ruins, replaced by the thunder of trucks, tanks, and the endless rumble of supply convoys heading east. From Cologne to Wesel, from Remagen to Oppenheim, Allied engineers turned riversides into industrial zones. Cranes swung over waterlogged banks. Bulldozers carved out new approaches. Floating fuel lines snaked across the river, feeding armored spearheads that no longer needed to wait for refueling. Every bridge that went up accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich. General Eisenhower himself toured the crossings, standing on the same decks where engineers had worked under fire just weeks before. He watched supply trucks roll past and nodded silently, understanding that these bridges were not just military assets, but symbols of inevitability. This, one officer remarked, is how a war ends, not with one explosion, but with 10,000 bolts. As the Allies surged forward, the Rhine faded into the background of a much larger story. The American 1st and 9th Armies swept east toward the Elbe. Patton's 3rd Army raced through central Germany, capturing towns so fast that maps had to be redrawn daily. In the north, British and Canadian forces advanced with equal speed, sealing off escape routes and linking up with the Americans near Münster. Behind them, the engineers continued their quiet war, dismantling bridges damaged beyond repair, maintaining those still vital, and clearing the river of debris. Their work was invisible but relentless. When a section of pontoon drifted loose, they waded waist-deep in icy water to secure it. When a truck column collapsed a plank under its weight, they rebuilt it before dawn. The Rhine crossings were living arteries, fragile yet unstoppable. Across the river, Germany was dying. Cities lay in ruins, their once proud skylines reduced to skeletal frames and chimneys. Refugees fled eastward, dragging carts through the wreckage, only to meet Allied columns coming the other way. In villages near the Rhine, children watched tanks roll past the same fields where they had once played. The war now too large to comprehend. And yet, amid the destruction, something remarkable happened. Order began to return. Engineers who had spent months building for war now rebuilt for peace. They repaired civilian bridges, reopened roads, and restored water systems. The same hands that had built the pathways of invasion now became the architects of recovery. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the Rhine crossings stood as silent witnesses to victory. Most of the pontoon bridges were dismantled within weeks, their materials reused for reconstruction. Only a few traces remained. Anchor chains buried in mud, fragments of steel, photographs in faded albums, but their legacy was immense. Historians would later call the bridging of the Rhine one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering in modern warfare. It wasn't just a logistical success, it was a psychological breakthrough. A moment when imagination and precision triumphed over chaos. The men who crossed the Rhine didn't just win a battle, they built the road to the end of the war. For those who survived, the river would never look the same again. Some returned home to construction jobs, others to quiet towns and families waiting for them. Yet, whenever they saw a bridge, they remembered the hammering of pins under fire, the flash of artillery, the roar of the current, and the impossible feeling of watching something rise from destruction and carry the weight of victory. The story of the Rhine bridges is more than a tale of steel and strategy. It is a testament to human will under pressure. When the world's greatest war reached its final river, it wasn't brute force that decided the outcome, but discipline, calculation, and courage measured in seconds. Those engineers, young, exhausted, half-deaf from shell fire, built not for glory, but for necessity. Each hammer strike, each cable pulled across the freezing current, carried the weight of armies and the hope of an ending. They proved that even in war, creation can be mightier than destruction. The German soldiers who watched from the far bank understood it too late. That technology and manpower alone could not stop a force built on ingenuity and relentless coordination. The bridges across the Rhine became symbols of inevitability, the moment when the Allies ceased to be an invading army and became the authors of Europe's liberation. Long after the last guns fell silent, their work endured, in textbooks, in training manuals, and in every modern army that still teaches the principles of combat engineering born on that river. Today, when we look at the photographs, men in drenched uniforms tightening bolts under falling shells, pontoon decks rising through smoke, we see more than just war. We see the triumph of the human spirit's quiet genius, the ability to build amidst ruin, to turn chaos into order, and to find victory not only through destruction, but through the power to create. Across the Rhine, the waters still flow, silent, unbroken, timeless. But beneath their surface lies the memory of those bridges, those men, and the day the impossible was built under fire.